In the spring of 1861, along the humid banks of the Alabama River, in the heart of Dallas County, there existed a cotton plantation known as Thornfield Estate that would become the stage for one of the most disturbing scandals in Southern history. What transpired there would challenge every notion of propriety, morality, and human dignity that the antebellum South claimed to uphold. The master of this estate, Colonel Nathaniel Beauregard Thornfield, a man of considerable wealth and standing, would orchestrate an arrangement so perverse that even the morally bankrupt society that permitted slavery found itself unable to look away. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slaveholding South, tales that reveal the true cost of absolute power over human lives. Colonel Thornfield was 43 years old in 1861, educated at the University of Virginia, a veteran of the Mexican War, and heir to one of the most prosperous cotton operations in Alabama. His plantation sprawled across nearly 3,000 acres of rich bottomland, worked by approximately 220 enslaved men, women, and children. The Great House, a Greek Revival mansion with towering white columns, sat atop a gentle rise overlooking fields that stretched to the river's edge. Thornfield had married Evangeline Rousseau in 1852, when she was barely 17 and he 34. She came from New Orleans aristocracy, educated in French and music, pale as porcelain, with dark hair and eyes that contemporaries described as haunting. For 9 years their marriage had produced no children, a source of growing anxiety in a society where a man's legacy was measured in legitimate heirs, and a woman's worth in her ability to provide them. The plantation's economy depended on the brutal efficiency of cotton production. During harvest season, the fields hummed with forced labor from dawn until well past dusk. Among the enslaved population were 7 men who would become central to the scandal that would destroy the Thornfield name. There was Moses, 32 years old, the plantation blacksmith, powerfully built with scarred hands and a quiet dignity that no amount of degradation could fully extinguish. Samuel, 28, worked as a carpenter, lighter-skinned than Moses, son of a previous master and an enslaved woman, educated enough to read despite the laws forbidding it. Jacob, 25, served as a stable hand, known for his skill with horses and his brooding silence. Then there was Isaiah, 30, the head field driver, a position that gave him marginal authority over other enslaved workers and made him despised by some, pitied by others. Benjamin, 26, worked in the gin house, his fingers permanently stained with cotton lint and machine oil. Daniel, 24, was a house servant who moved through the great house like a ghost, seeing everything, saying nothing. Finally, there was Elijah, the youngest at 22, who worked in the gardens and was said to have the saddest eyes anyone had ever seen. The winter of 1860 brought unusual cold to Alabama. Inside the great house, Colonel Thornfield paced the halls at night, tormented by his childless state. His father's will had stipulated that Thornfield Estate must pass to a legitimate male heir of Nathaniel's blood, or else be sold and divided among distant cousins. As political tensions mounted across the South and talk of secession filled every parlor and courthouse, Thornfield became obsessed with the idea of legacy. He consulted physicians in Mobile and Montgomery. He made his wife drink bitter herbal concoctions prescribed by an elderly French doctor in New Orleans. He prayed in the plantation chapel, built by his grandfather, where generations of Thornfields had baptized their children and married their daughters. Nothing changed. Evangeline remained childless, and with each passing month, Nathaniel's desperation deepened into something darker. It was during the Christmas season of 1860 that the colonel made a decision that would damn them all. On a cold December night, after the plantation's enslaved population had been given their meager holiday rations and the great house was quiet except for the crackling of fires, Thornfield called his wife into his study. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. Oil lamps cast shadows on walls lined with law books and agricultural journals. What he proposed to Evangeline that night was spoken in whispers, but those whispers would eventually echo through drawing rooms across the South. The colonel, convinced that the fault for their childlessness lay with him rather than his wife, proposed that Evangeline should lie with selected enslaved men until she conceived. The child, if born with features that could pass as white, would be claimed as Thornfield's legitimate heir. If the child's appearance revealed its true parentage, it would be given away or worse. Pause for a moment and consider this. In a society built upon the premise that enslaved people were property, not human beings, even reproduction became another form of ownership. The Colonel's proposal revealed the ultimate corruption of power, where even the most intimate human acts could be reduced to transactions, where human beings could be bred like livestock for the benefit of their masters. Evangeline's response to her husband's proposition is lost to history, but what is known is that by January of 1861, the arrangement had begun. Thornfield selected the 7 men with calculated precision. They were chosen not for any quality they possessed as individuals, for in his mind they were not individuals at all, but for their physical attributes, their relative health, and their positions on the plantation that might allow the arrangement to proceed with some degree of secrecy. The Colonel established rules that were as rigid as they were grotesque. Evangeline would meet with 1 man per week, always in a small cottage that stood apart from both the slave quarters and the great house, a building originally used as a schoolroom for the Thornfield children who had never been born. The encounters would occur after dark. No words were to be exchanged. The men were to tell no one, upon pain of death. But in a community where enslaved people had learned to communicate in whispers, in songs, in glances across fields, and coded phrases that masters could not decipher, secrets were impossible to keep. Within weeks, the slave quarters hummed with knowledge of what was happening in the schoolhouse cottage. The 7 men, who had not chosen this any more than Evangeline had truly chosen it, bore the weight differently. Moses began to pray aloud at night, his deep voice carrying through the quarters with pleas for deliverance. Samuel stopped eating, his frame growing gaunt, his eyes hollow. Jacob disappeared for 3 days into the swamps before being dragged back by patrollers and whipped until his back was raw. The others endured in silence, their humanity violated in ways that even the daily horrors of slavery had not prepared them for. If you find yourself disturbed by these revelations, I encourage you to subscribe to Shadows of the South. These stories must be told, not to sensationalize suffering, but to ensure that we never forget the depths of moral corruption that slavery permitted, even encouraged, in American society. The comfort of forgetting is a luxury we cannot afford. The spring of 1861 brought 2 significant events. First, the Confederate States of America fired upon Fort Sumter, plunging the nation into civil war. Second, Evangeline Thornfield discovered she was pregnant. The Colonel received the news with a mixture of triumph and anxiety. For the next months, life on Thornfield Estate existed in a state of suspended horror. The 7 men continued their daily labors, though now watched by Thornfield with an intensity that unnerved even the white overseers. Evangeline withdrew into the upper rooms of the great house, seen only by her personal maid, a young enslaved woman named Celia, who had grown up in the house, and who watched her mistress's suffering with a mixture of pity and rage. As Evangeline's pregnancy progressed, Thornfield made preparations. He consulted with his lawyer in Selma about the inheritance. He spoke to the minister at the Presbyterian church about a baptism. He purchased a silver rattle from a jeweler in Montgomery and had the Thornfield family crest engraved upon it. But beneath these preparations for paternity ran a current of fear. What if the child's features betrayed its true parentage? What if the whispers that surely must be circulating among the enslaved population reached white ears? What if his wife, who had grown increasingly distant and hollow-eyed, revealed the truth in a moment of weakness or spite? The plantation physician, Dr. Marcus Calhoun, a heavy man with whiskey on his breath and secrets of his own, attended Evangeline monthly. He noted her physical health, but seemed deliberately blind to her spiritual deterioration. She had stopped playing the piano. She no longer attended church. She spoke in monosyllables when she spoke at all. The enslaved women who worked in the house whispered that the mistress was haunted, that she wandered the halls at night like a ghost, that she stood at windows staring at the slave quarters with an expression that was neither contempt nor sympathy, but something more terrible, recognition of shared captivity. Consider how slavery corrupted not just the relationship between master and slave, but every human relationship it touched. The colonel and his wife, trapped in their own moral prison, had become as deformed by the institution as those they enslaved. The difference was that they had chosen their prison, while others had it forced upon them. By October of 1861, as Confederate and Union forces clashed at places like Wilson's Creek and Ball's Bluff, as young Southern men marched away to war with flowers in their rifle barrels, Evangeline Thornfield went into labor. The birth was difficult, lasting nearly 2 days. Celia remained at her mistress's side, while Dr. Calhoun consulted his medical texts and administered laudanum. Colonel Thornfield paced the ground floor, smoking cigar after cigar, his hands trembling. Finally, in the early hours of an October morning, a child was born, a girl. She had her mother's dark hair, her father's, or at least the colonel's, thin nose, and skin that was pale but with an undertone that in certain light might suggest a heritage the colonel desperately wanted to deny. The colonel looked at the child and saw both his salvation and his damnation. He named her Virginia, after the state where he had been educated, and had her baptized within the week. But something in him had broken. Perhaps it was the uncertainty of paternity. Perhaps it was the weight of what he had done. Perhaps it was the way the enslaved people on his plantation now looked at him, not with the usual mixture of fear and deference, but with something closer to contempt, a subtle shift in demeanor that suggested the moral authority he had always assumed was his, by right had been irretrievably compromised. The months following Virginia's birth saw Colonel Thornfield descend into paranoia and cruelty. He sold Jacob to a slave trader, claiming the man had been insolent, but everyone knew the real reason. He had Isaiah whipped for a minor infraction, 50 lashes that left the man unable to work for weeks. He forbade any of the 7 men from being near the great house. He began drinking heavily, his Greek revival mansion transforming from a symbol of genteel Southern civilization into something more like a prison, with locked doors and windows watched by armed overseers. But the colonel could not control information. By the spring of 1862, rumors had spread beyond Thornfield estate. It began innocently enough, a comment from an overseer to his wife, who mentioned it to her sister, who told her husband, who spoke of it in a tavern in Selma. The wife of a neighboring planter heard whispers from her enslaved seamstress, who had a cousin at Thornfield. The Presbyterian minister noticed that Colonel Thornfield no longer attended services, and that when he visited the estate, he found an atmosphere of barely suppressed violence and fear. Slowly, the story spread through the networks that connected the planter class: dinner parties, cotton exchanges, Masonic lodges, church socials. The reaction was complex. Some refused to believe it. Some believed it, but blamed Evangeline, calling her a corrupted woman who had seduced enslaved men. Some blamed the colonel for weakness, for allowing his wife such freedoms. A few, very few, recognized the truth, that what had happened at Thornfield Estate was not an aberration, but a logical extension of the moral bankruptcy inherent in slavery itself. When human beings are reduced to property, when all power resides with the master, when the law provides no protection and society no recourse, then the only limit on behavior is the master's own conscience. And conscience, as Thornfield Estate demonstrated, could be a frighteningly flexible thing. In a society where even love was property, where children could be sold away from mothers and wives could be violated with legal impunity, madness seemed almost inevitable. The Thornfield scandal was shocking not because it violated the principles of the slave-holding South, but because it revealed them too clearly. By the summer of 1862, as Confederate forces under Robert E. Lee pushed toward Maryland, and the war entered its bloodiest phase. The social consequences reached Thornfield. Neighboring planters stopped visiting. Invitations to social events ceased. The Thornfield family pew at the Presbyterian church sat empty, not because the colonel was forbidden from attending, but because the silent judgment of the congregation was unbearable. Evangeline, who had already retreated from society, now became a complete recluse. She spent her days in the nursery with Virginia, rarely sleeping, growing thinner and more spectral with each passing week. The enslaved community at Thornfield watched the disintegration of their masters with mixed emotions. There was no joy in it, for they knew that a desperate master was a dangerous master. And indeed, the colonel's response to his social isolation was to tighten his control over his human property with increasing violence. The overseer he hired in late 1862, a brutal man named Gaines from Mississippi, introduced punishments that shocked even the other enslaved people in Dallas County. Men were put in stocks for days, women were separated from their children for minor infractions, the fields ran red with the lash. Moses, who had prayed so fervently in the early days of the scandal, attempted escape in December of 1862. He was caught in the swamps by patrollers and their dogs. His punishment, carried out in front of the assembled enslaved population, was medieval in its cruelty. The war came closer. By 1863, Union gunboats controlled much of the Mississippi River, and Alabama planters worried about invasion. Young white men from Dallas County marched away to fight at Vicksburg and Gettysburg. The cotton economy faltered as the Union blockade strangled southern ports. Inflation ravaged the Confederate currency. Through it all, Thornfield estate endured, but it was an endurance born of inertia rather than vitality. The great house fell into disrepair, fields went unplanted, the enslaved population dwindled as some were sold to pay debts, others died from overwork and disease, and a few slipped away into the night, seeking freedom with Union forces. It was in the spring of 1864, almost 3 years after Virginia's birth, that the final act began. Evangeline, who had been slowly disappearing, became gravely ill. The illness was never properly diagnosed. Dr. Calhoun, himself now impoverished by the war and drinking more heavily than ever, suggested it was a wasting disease, perhaps consumption. Celia, who tended her mistress until the end, believed it was something else entirely, a deliberate surrender, a conscious decision to stop living. Evangeline died on March 15, 1864, at the age of 29. Her last words, spoken to Celia, were never recorded in any official document, but according to oral histories, preserved in the African American community of Dallas County, she said, "Tell them I'm sorry, tell them all I'm sorry." Colonel Thornfield buried his wife in the family cemetery, a small plot surrounded by iron fencing on a hill overlooking the river. He did not weep at the funeral. The few neighbors who attended noted his complete absence of emotion, a blankness that suggested something fundamental had been extinguished. After Evangeline's death, the colonel's decline accelerated. He stopped managing the plantation entirely. Gaines, the overseer, ran things with increasing brutality and decreasing oversight. Virginia, now 3 years old, was cared for primarily by enslaved women in the house, particularly Celia, who despite everything that had happened, could not bring herself to abandon a child. The truth of Virginia's parentage would never be definitively established, but as she grew, certain features became more pronounced. Her skin remained pale, but her hair had a texture that suggested African heritage. Her features, beautiful by any standard, contained subtle markers that the race-obsessed society of the Old South had been trained to detect. The colonel seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge what was becoming obvious to everyone else, or perhaps, in his deteriorated mental state, he simply no longer cared. The end came in April of 1865. Lee surrendered at Appomattox on the 9th. News reached Dallas County within days. The Confederacy was finished. Slavery was finished. 4 million people were about to be freed. At Thornfield Estate, the remaining enslaved population waited to see what would happen. Some began to leave, even before official word arrived. Others stayed, uncertain where to go, or what freedom actually meant after generations of bondage. Colonel Nathaniel Beauregard Thornfield was found dead in his study on April 20, 1865. The official cause was recorded as apoplexy, but those who found him noted the empty laudanum bottle on his desk, the glass of whiskey, the letter he had been writing, unfinished. The letter, addressed to no one in particular, rambled through confessions and justifications, through memories and regrets, through an attempt to explain what had possessed him to make the decisions that destroyed everything he claimed to value. It was never published, though fragments supposedly survive in private collections. One sentence, oft quoted, read, "I believed I was a god on my own land, and I learned too late that gods are merely men with too much power and too little conscience." The estate was sold for debts. The land was subdivided. The great house, that symbol of Southern gentility, was abandoned and eventually burned, whether by accident or intention, no one could say. The enslaved people of Thornfield scattered into freedom, carrying with them the story of what had happened there. Some of them, years later, would tell these stories to their children and grandchildren, ensuring that the memories survived even as the white South tried desperately to forget. What happened at Thornfield Estate was not an isolated incident of individual moral failure. It was the logical conclusion of a system built on the premise that human beings could be owned, that some people's bodies and lives belonged to others, that power unchecked by law or conscience would limit itself. The Colonel's particular perversity was shocking, yes, but it was shocking because it revealed too clearly what slavery had always been, a moral cancer that corrupted everything it touched. Of the 7 men who were forced to participate in the Colonel's scheme, records are incomplete. Moses was confirmed to have survived the war and settled in Mobile, where he worked as a blacksmith and became a deacon in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He never spoke publicly about Thornfield Estate. Samuel became a teacher during Reconstruction, educating freedmen's children, until his death in 1878. Daniel was killed in 1866, shot by night riders, part of the violent backlash against Reconstruction. The fates of the others are lost to history, their names surviving only in fragmentary plantation records and oral traditions. Virginia Thornfield's story is perhaps the saddest of all. As a child of uncertain parentage in a society obsessed with racial purity, she occupied an impossible position. After the Colonel's death, she was taken in by distant Thornfield relatives, who treated her with cold charity, raising her in isolation, never allowing her to forget that she was suspected of carrying tainted blood. She never married. She died in 1921, at the age of 60, having lived her entire life under the shadow of her father's sins and her society's cruelty. According to her obituary in the Selma Times-Journal, she spent her final years working with orphanages and schools for African American children, perhaps seeking some form of atonement for circumstances she had not chosen and could not control. The Thornfield scandal, like so many stories from the slave-holding South, was eventually suppressed, minimized, and whitewashed. Local historians mentioned it, if at all, in euphemistic terms. The narrative shifted to portray the Colonel as simply mad, an individual aberration, rather than a product of his system. But the African American community of Dallas County preserved the true story, passing it down through generations as both a horror story and a moral lesson. It served as a reminder of what their ancestors had endured and survived, of the countless ways that slavery had violated human dignity, and of the importance of remembering even what was painful to remember. These stories reveal the true moral price of absolute power, the devastating cost of a system that treated human beings as property, that separated families, that violated bodies, that destroyed souls across generations. The Thornfield scandal was not an exception to the rules of Southern slavery. It was those rules taken to their logical extreme. Every element of the story, from the Colonel's initial desperation to the social conspiracy of silence that followed, from the enslaved people's suffering to their resilience, from Evangeline's psychological destruction to Virginia's cursed legacy, all of it was made possible by a society that had constructed elaborate legal, religious, and philosophical justifications for treating human beings as things. The Old South wanted to remember itself as a civilization of grace, honor, and nobility, a pastoral paradise of moonlight and magnolias, where happy slaves sang in the fields and benevolent masters presided over orderly plantations. The reality was Thornfield Estate, a place where power corrupted absolutely, where human beings were reduced to instruments of other people's desires, where families were destroyed not in spite of the system, but because of it. The scandal that destroyed the Thornfield name was simply slavery, showing its true face, stripped of the elaborate mythology that usually concealed it. We tell these stories not to wallow in past suffering, but to understand the long shadow that slavery still casts over American society. The trauma inflicted over those centuries did not end with emancipation. It echoed through generations, shaping the freedmen and their descendants, shaping the structures of society, shaping assumptions about race and power that persist even now, more than a century and a half later. The silence that the white South preferred, the deliberate forgetting of stories like Thornfield, was itself a crime, an attempt to escape accountability by erasing history. But history cannot be erased, only suppressed, and suppressed history has a way of rising again, demanding acknowledgement. In cemetery records and courthouse documents, in oral traditions and fragmentary letters, in the very landscape of the South, where plantation houses rot and slave quarters crumble, the stories persist. They persist because truth persists, because the dead deserve to be remembered, because the enslaved people who suffered and survived deserve to have their full humanity acknowledged, including their suffering. The Alabama River still flows past the site where Thornfield Estate once stood. The land is now subdivided into small farms and residential plots. Nothing remains of the great house, except a foundation stone and some scattered bricks. The slave quarters are long gone. The cemetery, where Colonel Thornfield and Evangeline lie buried, is overgrown. The iron fence collapsed, the stones barely legible, but the story survives, passed down through the descendants of those who lived through it, preserved by historians who understand that uncomfortable truths are often the most important truths. If these revelations disturb you, good, they should disturb you. The history of American slavery should never be comfortable. It should challenge us, haunt us, make us question how such horrors were permitted and justified. Share this story, discuss it, grapple with its implications. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that remembering is essential, that the price of forgetting is too high, that we honor the dead by refusing to look away from their suffering. The Thornfield scandal stands as a testament to slavery's capacity to destroy everything it touched: families, communities, bodies, souls, and the very possibility of moral society. It reveals the lie at the heart of the Old South's self-conception, the truth that no amount of genteel manners or classical architecture could conceal, that a society built on human bondage was fundamentally depraved, that power, without accountability, inevitably became monstrous,
that the masters were as trapped and deformed by the system as the enslaved, though their suffering was of their own making, while the enslaved suffered innocently. These are the shadows of the South, the stories that were meant to be forgotten, but must instead be remembered. They are our inheritance, all of us who live in this nation that was built partially on the labor and suffering of enslaved people. We inherit both the wealth that slavery created and the moral debt it incurred. We inherit the trauma and the resilience, the shame and the necessity of acknowledgement. The Thornfield scandal, in all its horror, is part of the American story. It cannot be separated out, cannot be forgotten, without cost. It must be told, must be faced, must be understood, not as ancient history, but as the foundation upon which our present was built. The Colonel wanted an heir and a legacy. What he left instead was a cautionary tale about the corruption of absolute power, a story that would outlive his name and his estate, a warning etched in suffering about the cost of treating human beings as property. That legacy, dark as it is, may be more valuable than any legitimate heir could have been. It teaches what must not be forgotten, that slavery was not a benign institution gone awry, but a fundamental evil that corrupted everyone it touched, that the price of power without conscience is the destruction of humanity itself, and that the only path forward is through unflinching acknowledgement of what was done, who suffered, and who benefited. This is the story of Thornfield Estate and the scandal of 1861, preserved here so that it might not be forgotten, so that the enslaved people who suffered there might be remembered as the full human beings they were, so that we might understand the true cost of America's original sin. May we have the courage to remember, may we have the wisdom to learn, may we build a future that honors the memory of those who suffered by ensuring such horrors never happen again.